What was your don't tell your mother moment with your dad? My dad used to drive me to my flute lessons across town every Wednesday evening. On our way back home every week, we'd stop at Baskin-Robbins, and he'd let me get a double scoop in a waffle cone, and we'd sit inside, take our time, and talk. It was a really special thing since both my parents worked 2 jobs and had to chauffeur around 2 high school-age kids to various functions/activities. Getting to spend one-on-one time with either of my parents was a rare and fortunate thing. The thing was, they both worked 2 jobs because we weren't that well off, so weekly stops at Baskin-Robbins was a splurge thing, and I wasn't to tell my mom or my brother about it. Schedules flipped around about a year later, and my mom was the one to take me to flute lessons, and she'd always get good junk food from the gas station. Easy cheese and wheat thins or potato wedges, and we'd eat in the car and talk. Neither parent knew the other spoiled me on Wednesdays.
That sounds like a nice routine with your dad. I can relate to those simple moments that mean a lot. It's interesting how small things, like ice cream or snacks in the car, can create special memories. It kind of shows the lengths parents go for their kids, even when times are tough. Switching to your mom's snacks is a fun twist. It's cool how both parents found ways to connect with you in their own way.
When I was about 7, my mom bought a cheap blender for the kitchen. It was one of those ones where the blending thingy points downward. You have to insert the jug from the front, and it's designed in such a way that you could basically put any old cup in there, and it will still work. Mom was very strict in that we were not allowed to use just any cup. We had to use the special blender jug. Dad hated that thing because it was a pain to clean. Soon, the day came when Mom was out, and I asked my dad if I could make a milkshake. He chucked all the ingredients straight into the milkshake cup and stuck that into the blender. I, being a bit of a snot, reminded him that we had to use the special jug because Mom said so. Dad replied that, well, Dad can do it this way because Dad said so, then promptly turned the blender on and sent milk, chocolate, banana, and ice cream splattering all over the kitchen ceiling.
That sounds like a classic dad moment. It's always funny when they break the rules and things go sideways. I can imagine the mess he made. My own dad had a similar moment with a soda can and a blender. Let's just say, there were fizzy explosions everywhere. It's those little stories that make family life memorable, even if the cleanup isn't great.
When, after several hours of failure and frustration and having to send me to bed halfway through the setup, my dad sneaking upstairs to wake 11-year-old me up just after midnight with the simple phrase, "I got the new PlayStation working. Come and have a go. But shush, your mom is in bed." First game we booted up was Alien Trilogy. Those graphics, man.
That sounds like a cool memory. Sneaking in gaming sessions can be thrilling. Waking up to play a new console feels special, especially when it's late at night. Alien Trilogy must have felt intense back then. It's funny how those early gaming experiences stick with you. Even the graphics, which seem basic now, were a big deal at the time. It definitely adds a unique charm to those moments spent together.
Growing up, my parents worked 1 full-time job and 2 to 3 part-time jobs to make ends meet. When I was 6 or 7, my mom had just had a tough week. She had been fired from one of her jobs, her brother called and asked for money again, meth addict, and she was just not doing well. When she was at her last job of the day, my dad is trying to make her something special for dinner. Bless his heart, he's so bad at cooking. He realizes he can't finish without some ingredient, and he didn't take the time to put me in my car seat and take me through the store. So he leaves me on the couch with a book and a promise not to move. Then, he rushes to the store, and while he's rushing back, he gets pulled over and gets a speeding ticket. He told me not to tell Mom, and I guess paid it all off with part of his checks, and just told my mom he hadn't worked as much. DR, my dad got a speeding ticket trying to do something nice for my mom.
That's a pretty relatable story. Sometimes, trying to help someone just ends up backfiring. Your dad meant well, but it shows how tough life can get when you're trying to juggle everything. It's those little things that make you realize how much people care, even if it doesn't always go smoothly. Life is a mix of good intentions and unexpected hurdles.
My dad is a great dude. When I was 13, LOTR, FOER was being released. There are really no words to describe how excited I was for this film, and I begged my parents to take me to the midnight showing. It turned out that I had some sort of standardized testing the next day, so it was out of the question. I remember my dad making a big deal out of how everyone had to go to bed early so I could be well rested for my test. I was furious, lying there wondering what the movie would be like. Slowly, I slipped into my own dreams of Middle-earth. Suddenly, I was shaken awake. Mom's asleep. I've got the tickets. Let's go quietly. Best night of my life. I did fine on my exam, I still made it to a good college and got a real job and all that. I don't know if my mom figured it out, but at that point my parents were often sleeping in separate rooms, so it is possible we got away with it.
That's a solid story. Your dad really went above and beyond to make it happen. Sneaking out to catch a midnight showing of LTR sounds like a classic move. It's nice that you still did well on the test after all that excitement. Shows how sometimes breaking the rules can lead to some of the best experiences. Your parents probably had their own way of handling things behind the scenes. Kids remember those nights.
When I had my driver's permit, my dad was supposed to help teach me to drive. He had me drive him everywhere, and teaching me consisted of him leaning the seat back, turning the radio on low volume, and napping until we got to our destination. I remember the first day it happened, he just said, "I'm supposed to be monitoring you closely and keeping an eye on every move you make, but I'm tired. You'll be fine. Just don't speed. And your mom doesn't need to know I'm asleep, or she'll kill us both." What Dad doesn't know is when my brother got his permit last year, Mom's way of teaching him to drive was the same concept.
That's a pretty laid-back approach to driving lessons. It's funny how parents have their own style of teaching. Sounds like your dad was more relaxed, while your mom kept it on the down low for your brother too. At least you all got your permits without too much stress. It's those moments that stick with you, right? Just kind of shows how each parent has their way of handling things.
Back when I was at school, I had a habit of lashing out at people who picked on me. Good for avoiding bullying after a few times, bad for having friends and not being called psycho. An older boy came up behind me and poured a drink on my head. I responded by turning around and punching him repeatedly in the face. Devolved into usual schoolboy scuffling until he ran off after seeing a teacher coming. I got into trouble as he definitely got the worst of it, but got off the hook as he was older and had a history of bullying. Ended up just being sent home to my parents. My mom was at work and my dad was working from home, so he took the call and met me coming in. I was terrified what would happen. The times I'd fought before that my mom had come down on me hard, as she was the strict one. But the only conversation was, "Did you start it? No. Did you finish it? Yes. Did he deserve it? Yes. Let's go watch TV. Don't tell Mom. Love that man."
That sounds like a classic school story. I can relate to the struggle of standing up for yourself. It's funny how things can turn out. Your dad's take on the situation is solid. He seems to understand what you went through. Those moments when you think it'll be a big deal, and then it turns into something simple, are always surprising. Sometimes, it's just about having that one person in your corner who gets it.
My dad died when I was 12 years old, but one of my favorite memories of him was a "Don't Tell Your Mother." I was probably about 6 or 7 years old at the time, and he worked as a bus driver for our local public transit. He owned a Suzuki Madura and used to ride into work on good weather days. He used to take me into work with him from time to time, and I would ride the bus with him all day. So the first time he decided to ride his motorcycle in with me, my mother told him to take me down the slower streets and not the interstate. I woke up super early with him, and he proceeded to ask me, "Do you want to take the slow way or the really fast way?" Naturally, I wanted to go the fast way, so he told me never to tell my mom. Every time after that, we would blaze down I-95 to his job with me, hanging on tight to his back. I remember my helmet clanking into his and having the time of my life. I now own my own bike and can't wait to get fixed up. I really miss my dad. Edit. Obligatory thanks for the gold.
That sounds like a memorable experience. It's cool how those moments stick with you. The thrill of riding with your dad must have felt special, especially knowing you were breaking the rules a bit. It's nice you have a connection to him through biking now. Missing someone does reshape those memories, making them even more meaningful. It's good you can carry that part of him with you as you ride.
My mother had to move away for a year for job-related reasons. I remember clearly that she sat my father down in the kitchen, who up until that point had been the one to work more and had been around less, and told him exactly what the rules were for us kids. One of them was being in bed by 9 p.m. As soon as she was out the door, my father turned to me and said, "Children of the Corn is on tonight. You want to watch it?" It was on at 2 a.m., and the first horror movie I watched, I was 11. Luckily, I loved it, and horror movie nights became our secret thing to do when my mother wasn't around.
That's a classic dad move. Kids have that way of bonding over things they're not supposed to do. Watching Children of the Corn at 2 a.m. must have been a wild introduction to horror. It's cool how those moments become special secrets between you and your dad. I guess those late-night movie marathons became part of your routine when your mom was away. Simple times, really?
Once my mom was out of town, and she left me with my dad. My dad, not being the best cook in the world, proposed to go out for a pizza. After the dinner, he drove in the industrial area, a very well-known area, to receive some kind of special services during the night. So he approached a prostitute and asked how much for this young fella. I wanted to jump out off the passenger seat and run under a car. I was 16 at the time. I managed to bury and forget about this until today. Thanks, Reddit.
That's a pretty wild story. It's weird how those moments stick with you, even when you try to forget. I can imagine the awkwardness of being in that situation. Not something you expect your dad to say, especially at that age. Guess it's just one of those cringe memories that pops back up, and you can't really do much about it but chuckle.
When I was 15, I used a skateboard up and down my street from the time I got home from school until I went to work. One day, my dad met me at the end of the road coming home from his job and told me to grab onto the bumper of his 1993 Bronco. I held it for a bit, but at around 20 miles per hour, I started to lose control, and the wobble was too hard to handle. I was just wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and I destroyed my forearms and legs. I was scabbed up for quite a while, and my mom never knew that it was because I was pulled behind the car. I told her I went down a nearby hill too fast and lost control. My dad wrote me a couple sick notes for my silence, and I got to stay home from school and bullshit for a couple days.
That sounds like quite an adventure. I get the thrill of skateboarding, but getting pulled by a car is a whole different level. Those scrapes must have hurt, though it's classic to come up with a story to cover up something like that. Guess your dad knew how to keep you out of trouble. Plus, getting a break from school for a few days is always a win, even if it came from a bit of chaos.
For at least 10 years of my life, I've bugged my parents to let me race cars. Finally, when I was 19, my dad agreed to let me do skip barber racing school. But the only condition was that I couldn't let my mom know. She's super nervous and protective, and the only reasons I was never allowed to start racing was she could crash and die, and she's a girl, and only boys like cars. She came from a very old-fashioned family. Anyways, my dad ended up withdrawing money as a money order to pay for racing school, and he told my mom that he was coming to visit me for the weekend during the 5 days that I had the classes. Mom still to this day doesn't know.
That's a wild story. Sneaking around like that, I can imagine the thrill of racing mixed with a bit of guilt. It's kind of cool how your dad supported you while keeping it from your mom. Must have been intense to train and not let anyone know. I get why your mom was worried, but it's good you got that chance. Racing must have been a way to break free from those old ideas.
My dad would let me watch South Park with him, and the whole, "oh my god, they killed Kenny, you bastards," became our thing. The only time he'd let me curse was when my mom wasn't around. Then one day she overheard us. Sad face. Dad got in trouble, and he came sulking into my room and says, "Hey, in 7 Scully." We can't say it anymore. But I still gotta watch South Park. Smiley face.
That's a nice memory. It's cool how you and your dad had that little secret together. Sounds like your mom just wanted to keep things in check. At least you still got to enjoy the show, even if it changed a bit. Those moments can be simple but memorable, you know? A good mix of fun and a little rebellion.
It happened a few months ago. My mother works as a nurse in a Danish insurance company. Sometimes she's out getting patients who have been hurt and make sure they come safely home to Denmark. Now, right after my final exam, physics and chemistry, in which I got an A, I come home to 2 lovely things. To the message that my mother is happy with my result, but she was in the Caribbean getting a patient. My father, who's sitting in the kitchen with a grocery bag full of the sweets we usually buy in small quantities, ice cream, soda, chocolate, the works. We ended watching Game of Thrones and enjoying burgers in our living room. My dad looks at me and says, "For all Mother knows, we just ate the baked beans and eggs she prepared in the fridge." _it_. It seems as though people have taken an interest in my mother. If people are up for it, I could probably make an AMA where you guys could get all your questions answered. If people are up for it.
That sounds like a nice way to celebrate your exam results. It's cool that your mom was somewhere warm while you were hitting those books. Your dad's choice of food is pretty classic, too. Sometimes it's good to let loose and just enjoy the moment, especially with something like Game of Thrones. Your parents seem supportive, which is pretty great. An AMA could be fun if folks want to learn more about her experiences.
When I turned 16, my mom wouldn't let me get my license, but she really hated my dad, divorced. And, of course, Dad wanted his brownie points. He took me to get it about a week after I turned 16. My mom didn't know till I was 17 when I mentioned that I was driving one of my friend's car because he was tired. She flipped out on me telling me that I only had my permit and I was breaking the law at the top of her lungs. I just pulled my license out of my wallet and kind of threw it at her. I'll never forget the look on her face. Edit. This came up in one of the comments below. The reason she wouldn't let me get my license was because she required that I had a job first, but as a barely 16-year-old, I just wanted to hang out with friends. She wasn't some crazy mother or anything.
That's quite the situation. It's funny how the rules flip when you bring in a parent's influence. Sounds like you just wanted to have some freedom, but your mom was holding you back for her own reasons. It's wild when something like a license can create such tension. I bet that moment when you showed her the license was pretty memorable. It's like you were saying, "I'm already living my own life."
I was out driving my mom's car one night and decided, against my better judgment of course, to go to the Saturday races with my buddies. Long story short, my buddy ends up rear-ending me and I lie to cover my ass, saying it was a hit and run, but my buddy didn't. So word gets passed through our parents and my dad realizes the stories don't match. I am fucked. Dad asked to see me one morning and basically rips me a new asshole before I left for school. That evening he pulls me aside and says, "I'm not going to tell your mother, but I need to know you're not going to get a hair across your ass one day and tell her the truth." Still a secret for years later.
That's quite the situation. Sounds like a classic case of bad decisions all around. Covering for a friend can feel good in the moment, but it usually leads to more stress down the line. I get that feeling of keeping a secret, though. It's interesting how those moments shape you over the years. It's kind of wild to think you've held on to that for so long. Gotta wonder how it'll play out in the end.
Oh boy, I was like 15 years old, and I somehow had convinced my dad to buy me GTA SA for my birthday, him not knowing what it actually was. When he saw a bit of me playing, he realized this shit wasn't for kids. And he told me something like, make sure your little bro never watches you playing this game. He was 7. Cue to a couple of days later, I'm going to the computer to play a bit, and there my father was playing GTA in a fire truck mowing down people on the sidewalk. With my little bro on his knees laughing, he gave me this look.
That's classic. Your dad had no clue at first. Then he dives in himself. I can just picture the scene, a mix of surprise and laughter. It's wild how he switched from being the concerned parent to completely getting into the chaotic fun of it. Little bro having a blast just adds to the whole thing. Must have been a moment you'll never forget.
Just turned 18, and my dad took me on a road trip to Laughlin for a little gambling. On the way, there was the first and only time he told me about his experiences in Vietnam. He answered all of my questions, told me about friends who never made it home. At the end, he told me never to tell my mom, as he told me things she didn't even know. We've never discussed it since then, but being a vet now myself, I get it. And someday, I'll take my own son on a road trip.
That sounds like a real bonding moment. It's interesting how experiences like that shape relationships. It's tough to hear about those who didn't make it back, but it must mean a lot to connect with your dad like that, especially knowing you're in the same boat now. Passing down those traditions, like a road trip, seems like a solid way to keep that connection alive. Things like this stick with you.
There were a few, but 2 are my favorites. The first was when we got some fireworks from my uncle. Dad and my brothers and I all started setting them off in the backyard with my dad handling the big ones. One of them went rogue and shot off into the neighbor's backyard and set a trash can on fire. Rather than put it out or go tell the neighbor, my dad looked at the 3 of us and then ran into the house. We followed. 5 minutes later, there was a knock on the door, and it was our neighbor. My brothers and I stayed hidden and listened as our dad proceeded to act as if this was all news to him and pin the entire thing on my brothers and I and promised to handle the situation. After the neighbor left, he begged us not to tell Mom and promised to make it worth our while. My other favorite was when I was 12, and he kept me up until 2 a.m. because Monty Python and the Holy Grail was the late movie on ABC, and he told me everyone needed to see that movie and that we would just tell Mom I was sick the next day.
That sounds like a typical dad move. I remember a similar moment with a friend. We were messing with some firecrackers, and one flew into a bush. Instead of dealing with it, he just laughed and said we should hide. We watched as the smoke started rising, and he kept telling me not to panic. Eventually, we had to come clean, but it was one of those nights that you realize how ridiculous things can get.
Once, my dad and I both had the same idea to play hooky from work/school as a long con to avoid going to my mom's Christmas party at her school. We both hate hearing the children sing Christmas carols tone deaf, and my mom hates it when we don't go and suffer with her, because then she has to suffer through it alone. I remember both of us coming out of our bedrooms and literally bumping into each other because we both thought we were the only ones home. We locked eyes and knew the truth.
That's pretty funny. The whole sneaking out thing with your dad sounds like a classic move. It's like you two had this unspoken bond to avoid that party. I can picture the moment you both locked eyes, realizing you were on the same mission. It's a nice twist on the usual family dynamics. Sometimes, you just need to take a break from those gatherings. Good way to cope with the holiday chaos.
My mother was an alcoholic growing up, and some years ago, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. Some weeks later, I was just sitting next to my father on the couch watching TV, and he silently hands me a newspaper pointing at one particular stub of an article. It was about a study that claimed alcoholism leads to a significantly heightened risk of breast cancer. We then kind of decided that it was probably best not to share that with her, though there's no knowing if she had read the same article that morning. Kind of small thing, but the memory always stays with me, where it links 2 significant periods in my life together. I had a lot of those moments with my father.
That's a tough situation you shared. I can see how that memory sticks with you. Your dad's silent gesture said a lot, showing his care in a complicated time. It's interesting how certain moments can connect different paths in life. Those quiet exchanges can be powerful, especially when dealing with heavy things like health and family. It's good that you had those moments to bond with him.
My mother wasn't allowing me to have contact with my father while I was 13. He was living in Australia at the time, me in New Zealand, and I was going over for a sporting thing. She deliberately told me I was not to contact him while there. Needless to say, not only did I contact him, I stayed at his place and he paid for my trip. I'm 24 now, and she still has no idea I saw him.
That's an interesting situation. It's kind of wild how you managed to see your dad despite your mom's rules. I guess you wanted to connect with him more than anything else. Holding on to that secret for so long must be something. It's a bit of a rebellious move too, but sometimes you just have to follow what feels right to you.
When my cousin died, we took in his epileptic cat. My mom accidentally left the gate open, and she got away like two of my other pets a few years later. To this day, my mom believes she found another home, but my dad told me that he found the cat's body up the street on the side of the road, so he buried her in secret. My cousin's death was pretty hard on my family, including my mom, and my dad knew she couldn't handle it. Plus, she was going through her midlife change and acted crazy a decent amount of the time. That's why this is a secret. Oh, and I've smoked weed with my dad a few times.
This story hits hard. Losing family and then taking in a pet, only to go through that again, is rough. I get why your dad kept it from your mom. Sometimes, it's easier to protect those we love from more pain. And the weed thing with your dad, that sounds like a way to connect, especially during tough times. Life throws some heavy stuff at us, and we just have to figure it out.
We were on weekend vacation at London with my sister, me and Dad. My dad is huge F1 fan. Now when I say huge, I mean actually pretty huge. Not only he has a shrine for this stuff, but he also owns a lot of unique and costly pieces like certain driver's visor from certain competition and stuff. So, naturally we went to some kind of store with a lot of this stuff, and he sees a miniature car. In my eyes, it was much like the ones kids play with, that cost a few £100s. He made me and my sister swear we wouldn't tell Mom how much he paid for that tiny car figure.
Sounds like a typical dad thing. It's funny how he has all this F1 memorabilia and still goes for something that looks like a toy. I can picture him hiding it from your mom like a secret mission. Kids know the struggle of keeping those secrets. It must have made for a memorable trip watching him geek out while also trying to keep his purchase under wraps. Good times, I guess.
While my mother was out of the country, my 75-year-old father was home alone when he had a stroke and collapsed. He was somehow able to get to a phone and call 911. I went to visit him at the hospital. My sister was already there, but my mom wouldn't be able to get a flight until the next day. My father was a bit out of it and had difficulty speaking. He had to struggle to find every word. Go to my house close, my laptop.
That sounds really tough. It's wild how in a moment like that, he still thought about closing his laptop. Shows how his mind was still working on the important stuff. It must have been hard seeing him like that, especially with your mother not there. I hope he recovered well after all that.
After moving into a 300-year-old house, my dad, my brother, 3, and me, 5, discovered a huge milk snake in one of the walls. After being told to not disclose this finding to Mom, my brother and I excitedly broke the news to her. She was actually pumped to hear it, because it would take care of the mice.
It's funny how kids react to weird stuff. I remember finding a snake in my friend's old house. We were told not to say anything too, but we couldn't help it. His mom was surprisingly cool about it, just like yours. She thought it would keep the pests away. I guess sometimes, those scary moments turn into something useful. Funny how life works out.
When I was 8 or 9, I was with my parents and 2 of my sisters at the Festival Pier in Philly for some concert on the river. My dad told my mom that he and I were going to take a walk. A little while down, he saw there was a tent for a beer and bratwurst event. My dad asked if I wanted a sausage sandwich, and of course I did, so we popped in. He had a couple of beers, I got my brat. He said if my mom asked that we just went for a walk further down. Solid alibi until we got home, and they showed the Beer and Brats Festival on the news, and there we were, eating sausages with my dad raising his beer to the camera. We were so busted.
That's a funny story. Your dad probably thought he was being clever. It's always the unexpected moments that stick with you, like being caught on camera. I can imagine the look on your mom's face when she saw that news clip. It's cool how those little adventures become part of family memories, even if they don't go as planned. Makes you appreciate those simple times together.
Logging driving hours as a teenager to earn my license. I was driving, Dad was in the passenger seat. It was an 8-hour drive from Detroit to home. Driving Mom's Jeep, I went cruising around a long highway corner and nearly slammed into a group of deer. Missed one by a couple feet. Dad says, "Wow, nice driving. Now let's talk about what we don't tell your mother."
That sounds like a close call. Teenage driving lessons can be pretty intense. It's cool that your dad was chill about it too. Just goes to show that some experiences stick with you, especially when you're just starting out. I guess he knew it was probably best to keep that little incident to himself. It's all part of learning, right?
We were supposed to get to my uncle's marriage, and there was not enough room for us in all the cars, so my dad and I took public transport. When we arrived at the place, there was nobody in sight yet, so he brought me to a cafe just in front of the place and bought 2 orange juices, some food, etc. We waited for half an hour, and then we saw all our families going out of the marriage, which was over. "Don't tell your mom," he says while paying promptly.
That's a simple yet memorable moment. Just waiting in that cafe, enjoying some juice and food instead of being at the wedding. It's nice when small moments become special memories. That little secret with your dad adds a funny twist too. It sounds like a day you'll both remember for a while.
Mine was kind of depressing. After my dad's brother committed suicide, he tried to remain as strong as possible for us. However, one night a day or so after the funeral, my mom was out somewhere and I was home alone with my dad. I was about to go to bed and we were standing in the kitchen. All of a sudden, he completely broke down, looked at me, and said, "Dave, I'm going to miss my brother," and hugged me for about 5 minutes sobbing. And after we regained our composure, he said, "Don't tell your mother about this," and I still haven't some 28 years later.
That sounds heavy. It's tough when family members try to be strong but still feel everything inside. Moments like those can stick with you for a long time. It's interesting how you kept that promise for so many years. It shows a lot about the bond between you two. Sometimes, it's just those quiet, real moments that reveal how people cope with loss.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.